I am a strong person. I mean, I'm a 45-year-old vegan lesbian with no children. I don't generally care that much about what society thinks of me, sort of. But on the other hand, I care a lot.
The world's ending and animals are dying and everything is awful, but I'm fine.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey Posse, I'm your host, Chrissy Benson, broadcasting to you from Music City, Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome to the 100th episode of the Vegan Posse. We've come a long way since launching in October 2022, and in that time, we've done our very best to stay strong and stay true, and to help you do the same. Now, the holidays are right around the corner, so to get an early start on your holiday shopping, make sure to pick up lots of copies of everyone's favorite anti-romance romance, Marrying Myself, by me, Christine Melanie Benson. It's got a vegan protagonist, a surprise ending, and a revolutionary self-love message. It was featured on the 2023 VegNews magazine hit list, and you can find out all about it at my website, ChristineMelanieBenson.com. And please make sure to leave a nice review on Amazon while you're at it. It really helps to get the word out, and together we can start normalizing veganism through the arts. Also, in preparation for the holidays, if you're dreading the prospect of sitting around a table staring at a poor dead bird, check out my 7 lucky holiday tips for vegans, reposted in the show notes below. Finally, I am thrilled to report that we've got a new monthly series called Posse Talk with Jen Hawk. The first week of every month, I'll be chatting with my friend, Dr. Jen Hawk, who was previously part of the Beat Your Genes podcast with Dr. Doug Lyle. Jen and I will be chatting about life, love, relationships, human nature, and anything else on our minds. And we'll be taking your questions, comments, and topic suggestions, which you can email to us at veganposse.email@gmail.com. And now for this week's episode, where you get 2 special guests for the price of 1. When I first went vegan in 2011, I was astounded to discover that there was a whole world of vegan action happening all around me. And the way I discovered that was through an amazing podcast called Our Hen House, hosted by Jasmin Singer and Mariann Sullivan. A little over a decade later, Jasmin and Mariann had me on their show to talk about my novel, Marrying Myself. And now they're returning the favor by joining us on the Posse. In case you're not familiar with these 2 incredible women, Mariann Sullivan is a lawyer and teaches animal law at Cornell Law School. She has served as the chair of the American Bar Association's Tort Trial Insurance Practice Section's Animal Law Committee and the New York Bar Association's Committee on Legal Issues Pertaining to Animals. She is also the 2021 recipient of the Excellence in Animal Law Scholarship Teaching Service Award from the American Association of Law Schools. In addition to co-hosting the award-winning weekly Our Hen House podcast, Mariann hosts the Animal Law podcast. Writer and activist Jasmin Singer is the author of the VegNews Guide to Being a Fabulous Vegan, the memoir Always Too Much and Never Enough, and editor of the anthology Antiracism in Animal Advocacy. She is editor-at-large for VegNews, as well as the host of the VegNews podcast. Jasmin's influence extends to the media industry, where she's a host at WXXI, Rochester, New York's NPR member station. Along with Mariann, Jasmin co-hosts the Our Hen House podcast. So enjoy this conversation with Jasmin and Mariann. Welcome, Jasmin and Mariann. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the ride of your life?
Oh my God, I had no idea. That's wonderful. Yes, count me in.
I'm actually not sure, but we'll see.
Okay, the lawyer. Yes, the lawyer.
Yeah, always
making
cautious.
A disclaimer. Fair enough. I would expect nothing less. So, all right. Well, you ladies have so many interesting projects going on and such an interesting life story. And I think what I would love to do is ask you each some questions individually, and then we'll shift to more of a group discussion. So, Mariann, why don't we start with you? I'd love to take it back to basics. And why don't you tell us how and why you first went vegan?
Yeah, it's been a while. It was back in the 90s, and I was already old. I mean, I was in my 40s when I went vegan. I didn't figure this out really early on in life. And it was, as so many people, at least it used to be, I think, a part of a lot of people's story. It was about a dog. I got a dog. I had a dog when I was a kid, but she was mainly my mother's dog. So I got Calhoun. I loved him desperately. I just really, I'm sure many people listening get it, that when you get a dog and you realize like there's so much more going on here than you had ever imagined. And it just started me thinking that there was so much more going on with him, and I became kind of involved in dog things. And then I started just thinking about animals more generally. And I was lucky. I was a lawyer at the time. My job didn't have anything to do with animals. But I was able to join the very first animal law committee in the country, which was at the New York City Bar Association. And so that was a way to meet people who were also interested in animals and cared, and become a little bit more connected. And it was hard to find out what was going on then. It's very easy to forget that we didn't used to have the internet. It wasn't really, it was a while ago, I'm not going to lie, but it wasn't that long ago. And I actually ordered the Animals Agenda, which was a print magazine, and published by the great Kim Stallwood, wonderful activist, and started finding out what was happening. And I was like completely freaked out. Like I just had no idea what was happening to animals, and one thing led to another. And I decided to stop eating them. And fortunately, as I said, I knew a few other people because of being at the Bar Association who were on the same path. And that always helps when you're not all alone with something, especially back then when it was a little odd. I went back and forth, vegetarian, vegan a little bit, but once you do the research, like it's kind of a no-brainer. Like you find out what's happening to animals. The key is to never find out. Once you do find out, it's really hard to put it aside.
It's true, but by the same token, it's also easy to remain ignorant for a long, long time.
People manage to do that very
their whole lives. Yeah. I was a committed vegetarian, but an ignorant vegetarian for a long time with no clue.
Yeah, Jasmin and I have a Substack, and I just wrote a piece. I'm not here just to advertise my Substack, but just by coincidence.
Well, that's welcome too. That's fair territory.
I just wrote a piece, and it was about motivated ignorance, which is a thing. Like psychologists write about, not just about animals, but a lot of things. People talk about motivated reasoning, but I think an even more powerful force is motivated ignorance. People can deliberately remain ignorant about things that they don't want to know. And, I'm sure we all do all the time, because life is full of just really scary stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that we just decide to ignore. But I'm lucky that I didn't ignore this one, because it was both, as everyone probably listening knows, it's just a terrible thing to find out what's going on with animals. But I wouldn't ever go back. I wouldn't want to not know and spend my life participating in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you were not even vegetarian at the time that Calhoun came into your life.
Right.
Okay.
And like I said, I was in my 40s. I was no kid. I had gone a long time without really being motivated by ignorance myself, or motivated, I guess, to remain ignorant. It's a more accurate way of saying it.
Right. Well, also, as they say, you don't know what you don't know. and you don't think about what you don't think about. So
I
there are
think it
so
must be
many.
much, much harder now
Yeah.
because it's so much out there. And, people know, almost everyone seems to know that something bad is going on, that factory farming is a thing, and that it's not good. And so the effort to remain ignorant about it must take a lot more psychological energy. But you hear people say all the time that they do surveys of, and people say that the meat that they buy is not from factory farms. Like large percentages of people, like 50% of people in some surveys say they don't buy meat from factory farms. Like, where do they think their meat comes from? It all comes from factory farms, unless you're paying a fortune for it. And even then, it's questionable.
I didn't realize the stats were that high. I mean,
Well,
I
I
knew.
am I am citing that from memory, but I've seen a few different surveys, and people will very frequently say that. They're also like 50% of people will say that they are in favor of banning slaughterhouses. Now, what does that mean?
I
Like
remember
they
you
eat meat.
I know you
It's
discussed
confusing.
that on a recent podcast. I remember you talking about that, which is
Yeah.
very interesting to me. It's like, yeah, let's eat animals, but let's not have anyone
I
kill
mean,
them.
I think
Yeah.
what's clear is that just people don't have a lot of clarity in the way they think about this because they don't want to think about it. And like I said, I'm not saying that, we're better in this way, I think, but there are probably lots of things that I'm the same way about, that I'm ignoring a lot of the facts and just because I don't want to know. And I'm sure we would all be shocked to find out some things that we're unaware of, but this one, like I said before, I think this one is just becoming so much more obvious. And when you think of how many people really care about animals, not everybody, there are the psychopaths out there. I'm not saying there aren't, but
Yeah.
most people really would never, ever do this to an animal.
Right.
So
Right.
it just seems like it's just ripe for this collision of psychic energy around this issue.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree wholeheartedly. And the thing is, yes, there are a lot of things that we willfully remain ignorant about, but in some cases that's almost logical because there are some things where we really can't do much,
That's true.
to help. So there's no point worrying ourselves tremendously if we can't take any concrete action. But this is one area where we do have the privilege of being able to take very specific, very helpful, effective action, three
That's
times a
very
day.
true. So
So it's a great
that makes it even
opportunity.
harder to do whatever kind of justification you have to do to yourself in order to ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just
Well,
so much easier just to go vegan
I know,
than to
and
maintain
it's
this
so
whole
much
fiction.
better too.
Yeah, in every
That's the
way.
thing, because you become aware of this. I call it the parallel universe of suffering. But by the same token, you're ushered into what I think is the best way of living imaginable, and it's
Yeah.
wonderful. And so, I kind of hold both those things. Like on the one hand, it is, it's heartbreaking and weird just to walk around on a daily basis in this, dystopia, as Claire Mann calls it, aware of this universe of suffering that most people don't even acknowledge, don't even notice, let alone acknowledge. And at the same time, I feel so lucky to have, come into this way of life and to be
Yeah.
eating foods that nourish my body and to feel ownership and empowerment over my health.
Though it
So,
does make it so frustrating when we
yeah.
know that it's just such a great thing and makes your life better and makes you healthier. It's so frustrating
Yeah,
how hard it is to get this across to
I
people.
know. You think it's hard to get the message across to people? I find it very easy. I mean, everyone I
We're
talk to goes vegan.
we're putting you in charge, Missy.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Yes, I relate, of course. Jasmin, how and why did you go vegan?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I was also an ignorant vegetarian first. I think a lot of us were. However, I do think it's worth noting that in my anecdotal observations, that is changing and people are tending to go right to vegan. So I think back when
Yeah.
we were all going vegetarian first, it was partly ignorance due to a lack of accessibility to information. And food, like it was different back then. So I went vegetarian 25 years ago, when I was, oh gosh, I guess it was more than 25 years ago. It was like, I don't know, I was maybe 19 or something, and I was a theater student, and I wore all black and smoked clove cigarettes and figured, that being vegetarian went with the vibe. And so I just wanted to be like dramatic or something. I also think that my instinct was that meat was icky, that it was gross, but I never thought about it beyond that. In fact, I used to say I'm a vegetarian, but not the mean kind. And then when I was 24, I watched a documentary about factory farming, and I went vegan. So I learned about what was going on to dairy cows and egg laying hens. And I was an activist at the time fighting for people with AIDS and HIV. And I was very concerned about other marginalized communities. And so when I learned about dairy and eggs and the exploitation of the reproductive system and parts of both girls and boys, then I was like, okay, I'll go vegan. And I not only went vegan, but I changed the entire course of my life to speak up for animals. And so that's kind of in a nutshell my story. And now I've made a career out of being the mean kind. I'm kidding. I'm actually so nice. I could stand to be a little meaner. Mariann's doing the so hand. I am the nicest.
You have your moments.
Not really. I'm like, I really wish I wasn't so nice, to be honest. Are you nice, Chrissy, all the time?
Well, I'm curious what you mean by nice.
Like I accommodate, I was raised as a little girl in this world, and therefore I accommodate a little too often. You know what I mean? Like I'm a bit of a people pleaser. And to be honest, I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think that makes me a very good interviewer. So I think it has its charms because I make people feel comfortable, but then it bites me in the ass sometimes because it means I'm very sensitive and I'm very concerned about other people's experiences. So, that's why I'm vegan, because I'm an empathic soul. I'm sure it's the same for you both.
But what do you think, Chrissy? Do you think that being sensitive is having a particularly sensitive personality? Because I would say that's probably true of me too. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying, like, there's a hypersensitivity. Do you think that's common among vegans? You having heard so many stories?
It's hilarious that you mentioned that, because this is a topic that's come up many times during my interviews. And in fact, being sensitive was the negative mantra I heard my whole childhood growing up with my father, whom I love very much, but screaming in my face, you know what your problem is? You're too sensitive. Yes. and it cracks me up in hindsight, because on the one hand, he's probably right. But on the other, if you have a little daughter who really is too sensitive, screaming at her that she's too sensitive is really gonna
maybe it was a parenting technique he read about it or something. Like bury you in negative emotion and see how you do.
It's funny because my mom used to say to me sarcastically, everyone's off step but you. And I grew up and I realized that was true. Most people are off step except me.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. But yeah, the sensitivity thing, I mean, it was literally, as an adult, I was in a 12-step program at a meeting, and I heard someone mention being sensitive in a positive light. And my jaw dropped in that moment, because I was blown away that could be a good thing.
Yeah.
that wasn't, an Achilles heel that was going to prevent me from ever making it in the world.
Right.
That wasn't my fatal flaw. The fact that it could have a positive component just blew my mind. And I've talked to so many guests on my podcast who mentioned being sensitive. And it was funny because I had the former cattle farmer Harold Brown, whom I'm sure you two are familiar with, on the show last year. And I had first met him in person at Vegan Summerfest. And he and another activist, Lee Hall, were hosting a workshop at Summerfest on activism for sensitive people. And I saw that on the agenda and thought, oh, I'm there, that's me. And I went in thinking that it was going to be a handful of, sensitive people. The room was flooded.
Wow.
I mean, there were so many people there.
I mean,
It makes total sense. It makes total sense. So on the one hand, I definitely think that it makes sense that, being a little more sensitive than the average, we'd be a little more attuned to what's happening to vulnerable beings. I certainly don't think that that's required to be motivated to be vegan. I really think it's just,
right.
not being
But
a sociopath, would be sufficient to.
But it probably does make vegan activism particularly challenging for a lot of vegans, even though they feel very motivated to make change in the world and very passionate. Still, there's probably a lot of people who are introverts, and not that all sensitive people are introverts. I guess it's all personalities are more complicated than that. But still, being sensitive and getting upset easily when people aren't nice to you, that can make it hard to be an activist and go out there in the world and say something that people don't necessarily want to hear.
100%. That's definitely true for me. And Jasmin, you asked how nice I am. And part of why I asked to hone that definition a little bit was that it depends who you ask. Like in my view, I'm way too nice, kind of like you. I wish I could channel a little more just, volatility and just willingness to cause discomfort in the moment. Whereas if you talk to my sister, and she said this to me many times, like, Chrissy, your problem is you're too direct, you're just too in your face with your activism, and you're just too outspoken, and, it just makes people feel bad.
Yes.
It's judgmental. And I said what I said to her, which is completely true. I said, that's hilarious that you say this, because what you hear is maybe the 2% that I actually express. I'm suppressing 98% of what I'm thinking.
That's funny.
So what you're hearing, what you think is too much, that's like minuscule compared to what I really
the totally cleaned up version.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I certainly have that as well. Like I've been called bossy by men, who are not used to
who are never bossy themselves. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But also,
but they aren't ever bossy, are they? Because that word is never.
It's just their baseline. I mean, not everyone, but generally speaking, which I realize is problematic sometimes. But I am a strong person. I mean, I'm a 45-year-old vegan lesbian with no children. I don't generally care that much about what society thinks of me, sort of. But on the other hand, I care a lot. And because of the things that I stand for, even by just looking at me, I am judged as a certain sort of strength of character. Sometimes that doesn't even match what I'm doing,
Yes. Yeah. It's definitely interesting walking around in the world as a vegan.
Well, as a vegan. I mean, Jasmin always makes the point of like the person at the Thanksgiving dinner, and when you get past the turkey and you just pass it on to the next person, they're like, "Oh, really? What's your problem?" You don't even have to say anything when you're vegan to piss people off.
You don't even have to say anything. Yeah, I remember one of my friends talking about eating a salad in the kitchen at his workplace, and somebody looking over at him and saying, "Don't judge me. Stop judging me."
So funny.
Just sitting there eating a salad. Yeah.
That's very funny.
So, well, you ladies, I just find your story so interesting because you went vegan and then you launched a podcast before podcasts were even the thing. How did that happen? And did you envision the Our Hen House podcast, which is so groundbreaking? Did you envision it becoming what it's become?
Oh my God.
Which is a podcast that's taking over the planet in a good way.
Oh,
wow.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
I'll let Jasmin take this because she was totally the driving force.
Well, I mean, sure. Mariann and I have very complementary skills and, and talents. And I went vegan, and about 6 years later, in that 6 years, I wound up working for Farm Sanctuary, and I went down to PETA and volunteered, and I was writing for Satya Magazine, which doesn't exist anymore, but was an excellent magazine. I was writing for VegNews. I was doing local protests in New York City where we lived. And when at some point I started to become frustrated with the fact that people in general who wanted to do good things, they wanted to change the world for animals, were just kind of waiting for top-down organizational campaigns to dictate what they should do next or where they should send their $20, which I think is important. By the way, I think send the $20, sign the change.org petition. I'm not putting it down, but people generally wanted to do more. And, at the time I knew Mariann, obviously, and I was constantly wowed. I mean, Mariann gets shy when I talk about this, but I think she's just the most brilliant human I've ever met. And when she talks, it's like, especially because I was young then, I was being shaped to some extent by not only the way she saw the world, but also the way she thought. So I didn't come out of all of those conversations feeling exactly the same way, but I knew, maybe it's because she's a lawyer and she has the lawyer training, but I better understood how to weigh a situation. And I just felt like everyone should have access to her brain. And so we started Our Hen House in January of 2010. There were a couple podcasts at the time. Colleen Patrick Goudreau was there first, for example. And we lived in Soho down the street from the Apple store. And so I went every day and took the same workshop that they offered every day called Podcasting 101 or something. I bought the book Podcasting for Dummies. I read it front to back. We started the podcast. And then suddenly, within the first few months, the type of funding that was sort of floating around us was for nonprofits. And a few people were like, do you want to become a nonprofit? And we're like, what? So then we just were like, sure. I mean, yeah, there are media nonprofits, and that's the direction we went in. Mariann looks like she's going to say something. Did I?
Well, I can jump
Sure.
in, but no, I think that kind of covered the story. Yeah, Jasmin was very.
Well, first of all, how did you meet?
Okay. Well, Mariann and I were married to each other. And
we met before that.
I'm aware of,
okay. Well, I think a lot of people,
our listeners may not be. Yeah.
I think,
so why don't you tell the story as much as you're comfortable getting into?
Well, Mariann and I met because
I mean, most of the story is fairly boring. So
you say that, but I can't imagine that's the case.
I interviewed Mariann for an article I was writing for Satya.
Because we were both in New York City and both involved in the, in some aspect of the animal rights.
And we both had best friends. We both had best friends who were a couple. And so I heard her name come up here and there, and I knew who she was. And so when I was writing this article, I interviewed Mariann for Satya magazine. And then I had a really tight word limit, and the biggest mistake I've ever made, I didn't use her quote. So she made the cutting room floor. I regret it to this day. And then a few months later,
do you remember the quote that didn't make it?
No, but it was an article. Okay, so it was.
I'm sure it deserved to.
No,
die.
It was an article about animal rights and gay rights, and Mariann was not very involved in the gay rights world, but she was she was whatever. So I don't want to speak for Mariann, but she was not straight.
What it is you're planning on saying.
She was not straight. I will say that. And so I was like, oh, a not straight vegan. And so I interviewed her for it, and I don't remember what it was. I'm sure it was brilliant, though. I think I probably needed to draw more connections, and that's probably why I didn't use it. But a few months later, we were both at the Gay Center downtown, and there was an animal rights event happening at the Gay Center. They were just using the space, and it was an anti-foie gras meeting, I think, and I was working on an anti-foie gras campaign, and Mariann was being awarded an award.
I think it was an In Defense of Animals meeting.
Okay, I don't remember specifically, but you were being given an award of recognition.
I was.
And so I was oh, this Mariann Sullivan. And so I went up to her, and I, was like a punk. I looked terrible that day and just had no idea who I was really. And I introduced myself, and she was like, oh, and then she was like, do you know when we're going to get the pizza?
First things first,
just
yes.
seems like yesterday, doesn't it? I still remember that we never did get a piece of that pizza, did we?
It got cold in the corner.
They promised
I know.
it, and it was it looked bad, and it was really crowded.
So,
I mean, it was a vegan event. Like,
give us
in the night. Was it
No,
in the night?
it
Were
was
we in the
it was
90s?
in the aughts.
In the aughts. And they had pizza. Like, I wanted.
So I will say that our friends wound up getting married to each other, and there were these like events leading up to their wedding, and Mariann and I were both at these events, and we would kind of like look at each other from across the room and like bond over something little. Like, we bonded over I think a slogan that was on commercials in the 90s or something. It was, "We're all connected, New York Telephone." It was like, "We're all connected, New York Telephone." And I said something like, it's in my head, and we bonded over like the idea that everyone and everything is connected. Mariann, you don't remember this?
I don't. It sounds vaguely familiar.
So then I had a crush on. I mean, then I had a big crush on her, and we had an absurd age difference, and so she kept saying no. And then I just was like, I weakened her, and I was like, we're vegan, and that overrides this age thing. And so finally she was like open to this. And Mariann and I had a rapport from the beginning that I felt was its own entity. So there was me, there was Mariann, and then there was our rapport, in my opinion. And that rapport became the podcast. And Mariann is just, my favorite human. And I'm still obsessed with her brain. So that's how we met.
Well, that was very nicely put.
What would you say it is about Mariann's brain that is so special?
This podcast has taken an odd turn.
I agree, but I would have it no other way.
I think, first of all, Mariann is very confident in her perspectives and has given a lot of thought to them. So she doesn't just like spout out opinions willy-nilly. Like, she thinks about all perspectives of it. And she thinks about like the idealists kind of perspective, but also the tangible sort of on the ground perspective. It's not like she's not just going to think philosophically, she's also going to think realistically, but she's going to somehow blend the philosophy and the realistic parts together. She's also, sorry, Mariann, I know this is probably making very
this is
whatever.
It's a little
Mariann
weird. I'm not going to deny it. It's very nice. I mean, I appreciate everything you're saying, but I feel a little uncomfortable.
She's also hilariously funny, and she reminded me. This comment has aged in an unfortunate way, but she reminded me of Annie Hall a lot. That kind of quirky, New Yorker-y. At the time, she like wore overalls and had messy hair, and like she was just this quirky Soho character with this gorgeous pit bull. And like, I don't know, she's just like, how could you not fall in love with her? That's what I think. And I think our listeners.
That's what I used to say to everybody. How could you not fall in love with me? It's mysterious.
I think we're all on the same page with that. Yes, agreed. Yes,
very sweet.
No, you do have an amazing way. Well, both of you have amazing ways about you. Mariann, I just love how like wry and dark, but also positive and funny. It's just kind of like you were getting at, Jasmin.
I remember one
time
bring
so much to it. There's so many like angles and nuances and layers and all in one remark.
I love this podcast. I remember once my sister, who should know me reasonably well, this was when we were adults, and I said that somebody had said something that I was funny. And she said, "Oh, that's such a great compliment, because nobody ever says that about you."
So, siblings are the worst.
My family never thought I was very funny.
Well, you're also very serious. Yeah. I mean, I get
that. I'm more known for being serious. I have to admit.
Like Chrissy, if you look at any photos of Mariann from when she was a child, you could see that she was just trying really hard to do it right. Like whatever it was, like the pose with the hands crossed, or the whatever they told her to do, she was like, "Okay, I'm going to do that." Like there was a seriousness.
That's the sensitive part, isn't it? That we all share, all the vegans share. We want to get it right. Mm-hmm. We're worried.
Yep.
Warriors.
Except maybe the health vegans have, and I'm also a health vegan, but fundamentally at my core an animal vegan.
Right.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, we can
They
appreciate
can
all the
be
health
another.
benefits.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right, now I lost you. This has been such an interesting digression that I kind of lost track of where I was headed with this. So you launched Our Hen House, and I'm glad you mentioned the nonprofit aspect because I was curious about how that happened.
Well,
How
also when it started, it wasn't just a podcast. There was also a blog, which blogs were very big back then, and nowadays not so much. It's more. I mean, I guess the Substacks kind of things have taken the place of blogs, a little bit more longer form. But it was both a blog and a podcast, so it felt a little bit more like an entity. And the blog was totally I think we published every day, and
wow.
it was it was all based on ideas of what things people could do to advance the cause, or talking about some book about somebody who was doing something good for animals, or interviewing somebody, or a newspaper article that we found of something that was just people. There's so many people out there, and that's what we found since then in doing it's now just the podcast, but it's the same kind of theme. It's like we just interview all these different people who have found different ways in their own lives to express this passion and to try to make change. I remember when we first started, one of our funders too was very kind to give us funds, considering this is what he thought. He was like, aren't you going to run out of people to interview? And here we are 15 years later. Podcast has gone up every week, and for 15 years, and we haven't run out of people yet.
Yeah, I discovered your podcast in 2011 when I first went vegan, and I didn't realize at the time that it was still fairly new at that point. But for me, it really was a revelation that there was enough news to create a whole podcast around. And you guys had lots to talk about. And I remember just really appreciating your rising anxieties section, kind of how you flip the whole mentality, because rising anxieties is often about these horrible steps that animal ag is taking to quash veganism and the animal rights movement, but you flipped that on its head, taking the perspective, which I think is very valid, that okay, we've got some power, people are starting to hear us and starting to listen to us, and animal ag is terrified, and so they're lashing out. So this is a sign of our strength, not our weakness.
That was very much from the fact that when I first started becoming interested in this and doing research about it, as I mentioned, it was kind of pre-internet, and the industry completely ignored the animal rights movement. I mean, the industry was just a black box. You could not see into it. Like, it was very, very hard. It was before there were really undercover investigations. It was very, very hard to know what was going on. Like, people had kind of rumors, inside knowledge of what it was like in factory farms. So the industry just pretended that the animal rights movement didn't exist, and that people did not need to know anything. And it was really, really secret. And as it became more evident to people what they were doing through the work of people in the animal rights movement, and the longer it went on, the more people just found out and reported on it. And so it was a little bit more obvious what they were doing. And then they really started on their sites, which I look at, talking about the animal rights movement and how evil the animal rights movement was and how crazy they were and how awful this was. And it occurred to me at the time, well, they're scared. They don't want people to know. They really don't want people to know.
So who came up with the term rising anxieties?
Probably Mariann. If there's a good idea, it was probably Mariann's.
Well, that's really not true, but that one might have been mine since it was my column.
So how quickly did Our Hen House become a full-time venture for you all?
Well,
because you were, still doing your regular jobs, Mariann. You're a law professor. Jasmin, you do a zillion different things. You wite, you act, you host, you.
I would say we also had a couple other elements to it. Like, we had an ebook publishing arm, and we had a ticker tape, which was also kind of a thing back then, of breaking news as it relates to animal rights, which, like, you don't have a need for that anymore so much, but and we had some like interactive components with the public, like This Animal on This Day was inspired by View from My Window, and it was just people's animals, and so there were a lot of moving parts, and I think pretty quickly I started doing it full time.
I was not doing it full time at all. Jasmin was doing almost all of the the tech work, the background work, the there's a surprising, as I'm sure you know, the surprising amount of work that goes into doing a podcast, which now you can hire companies to do. Getting it up on platforms and whatever. But back then there really weren't. You kind of had to you had to sit down and read Podcasting for Dummies and figure it all out yourself. So yeah, Jasmin was doing that stuff full time. I was really just doing the podcast. She was doing mostly the blog work. So it wasn't ever full time for both of us, but we've gradually moved away from that.
Yeah, for a while it was, but then we started hiring a team, and now we have a team. Everyone is mostly part-time. I would say Vicky is very close to full-time, but it depends on the week.
Got it. And then at a certain point, Mariann, you started doing the Animal Law podcast. How did that come about?
Well, I guess it just seemed like I had a certain value to bring to, I was part, as I mentioned, one of my first ways of getting in touch with what was going on with animals was through a bar association. So I get involved with that. I got involved with the American Bar Association's Animal Law Committee. And it just kind of occurred to me that there were a lot of people out there doing work for animals, but it was very hard for them to know what the other one was doing, especially in any kind of detail. And lawyers really like to know, like, what other cases are going on, because that's how you come up with cases yourself. And it's just interesting for lawyers to listen to this, even though it might not be interesting for other people. Though I do find somehow that a lot of my listeners are not lawyers. I really admire it, because it can be a little hard to keep track of. So I just started. I was working at a court. I spent most of my career, at least the later half of it, working at a court. So litigation was really the thing I was most interested in. And I love, I just love telling the story of litigated cases. Each one is a story with heroes and villains and victims and not just in animal law, in anything, but that gets obscured by the fact that it all goes through the courts, becomes full of legalese and like technical details of the law. And so people lose the picture. In animal law, there are fascinating stories of people doing fascinating things. And it's not just cruelty laws or laws that directly affect animals, like the Animal Welfare Act at the federal level. Those are very important. The Endangered Species Act is another one, these were laws that were specifically passed to protect animals, and there can be litigation as a result of them. But there's also all sorts of other areas of the law. There's consumer protection law, when companies lie about that their food is humane, or whatever nonsensical term they're using, and somebody can sue them and say, well, that's not true. And there's First Amendment work nowadays. Of course, there's lots of activist work on behalf of activists who have gotten arrested. There's work on the other side when states pass laws like ag-gag laws that are prohibiting activists from getting onto farms to see what's going on. There have been a lot of constitutional efforts. So it covers a whole lot of different areas of law. And it's just fun. I just really enjoy hearing people's stories, and also getting into some of the technical details so that other lawyers listening might be inspired to bring similar cases.
Yeah, I'm trained as a lawyer myself, and I find it really interesting just hearing how different areas of the law can be applied, for the benefit of animals.
Totally.
But I'm curious, what role do you see the legal system as playing in the vegan movement? Like, how integral do you think our legal system is in this cause? And how much do you think of it as just more social justice, more about changing hearts and minds?
Well, I think it's both, but I think the legal system, I don't think it's integral, might not be quite the right word, but I think it's a hugely important part of the puzzle, because for one thing, there are the problems that occur when the industry starts to get laws passed. Most law that have anything to do with animals or agriculture favor the industry. So when they get laws that pass, then that's the effort to fight back, and the effort to, one social justice cause is trying to inform people about what's happening. Transparency is one of the most important goals of the vegan movement. Letting people know, our whole conversation at the beginning of this was how people willfully ignore what's happening. But it's a lot easier for them to willfully ignore it when it's really, really hard to find out. And so fighting that is an important part of social justice. I don't really see them as separate. The law serves the social justice efforts when it's doing the right thing, and it solidifies them. Like, it can put a protection into place. Like, I mean, of course, the protections that have been passed for animals have been minimal and extremely hard fought, but still there are states now that prohibit gestation crates for pigs. It's a minimal reform, but it is a reform. And in those states, it's actually illegal. So that's a real, like, if we just campaigned against gestation crates and they agreed to not do it, well, there would be no way to force them to not do it unless we got it placed into law. So I just see them as going hand in hand. I mean, the law, of course, is extremely conservative. I mean, social justice advocates have to be way out in front of what they can possibly accomplish legally, because that's going to be minimal. I mean, the law follows the activists. So the activists have to be out front. But I think the law is a very necessary part of the entire process, or else, nothing happens that will last.
Right, right. And what do you think? Like, there are other lawyers, of course, in the animal rights movement, and one of the very prominent people is Gary Francione, who talks about the abolitionist approach. What do you think of his work and his approach to veganism, which
I mean,
can
he
be
doesn't
very
actually
polarizing?
maybe early in his career he did. I mean, more of a theorist and
Yeah,
more of the
yeah.
philosophy of law than a practicing lawyer. So it's not quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that his work was very seminal in getting people to think differently about the legal status of animals. The realization that the fact that we consider them property, which was just, it's the kind of thing that sounds totally just the way it is until you realize, no, it's just the way we made it. We made up these rules and said animals are property, but that doesn't mean that that's the natural way of things. So I think a lot of his work was very seminal. I mean, there are certainly things that he, I don't agree with him about everything. I think some of his work he's very passionate about the right way forward. And as you said, I mean, I think I'm an abolitionist, but he's an abolitionist in the sense, and I think most people I know are abolitionists. Most vegans are abolitionists, but he's an abolitionist in the sense that he doesn't think incremental reforms are very useful, and sometimes they're actually damaging. That's a strategic position, and I don't necessarily share it. I wouldn't want to say I never share it. Like, it kind of depends on the situation, but yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what else to say about him.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm with you. I was at the Animal Rights Conference in DC early on after I had gone vegan, where he debated somebody else. I think maybe it was Bruce Friedrich or somebody. But
I think I might have been there.
Really?
It sounds so familiar.
Yeah, it was an interesting discussion. I mean, to me, it seems like people were spouting a lot of opinions that nobody really had concrete data to, either confirm or deny. I mean, to me, I found it interesting. I too, of course, I'm an abolitionist, but I mean, for me, my takeaway was it's a choice of where I want to devote my activist energy. Am I going to devote it to, getting bigger cages for egg-laying hens, or am I going to devote it to, trying to get people to go vegan?
Right, I think that's what we all have to do, is decide what we think is the best use of our energy. And it's,
right.
We're trying to change the way the entire world eats. Like, it's a big lift.
It's a big lift.
None of us is entirely sure how to pull this off. So we do our best and see what works and keep our fingers crossed. But, I'm kind of with you, and I know Jasmin is as well. It's like, we're not, like, the welfare reforms are not our passion. And, veganism is definitely, I don't know whether I'm speaking for you, Jasmin, but I think I am. Veganism is our passion. But that doesn't mean that I think that I know everything about how to pull this off.
Right. And I mean, again, I've said this many times on the podcast. I need to stop calling it a podcast because it's in video form now. So I guess it's technically not a podcast anymore. But I've mentioned this point many times, is that I've been to so many animal rights conferences, vegan conferences, events, and at every single one, there's a whole topic of discussion of how do we get this message across? How do we do it? And clearly, and it's so poignant to me because obviously that's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if there were a surefire way, if there were a silver bullet, then the world would be vegan. Obviously, none of us has the answer and the same line, the same approach that may work on one person one day won't even work on the same person the next day, or somebody else.
No, there are many pieces to this puzzle.
Many pieces, and so it's very interesting. But I have to give some credit to Jasmin because especially early in my veganism, I mean, I still feel this way very often, but it's daunting. It's a bummer that even now the numbers of vegans are so small. We're such a tiny sector of the population, even at this point, and it really seems hopeless in many ways. But I was at Victoria Moran's Main Street Vegan Academy when Jasmin was a lecturer, and you made the point, Jasmin, that we don't necessarily have to reach a majority or even a plurality. We just have to achieve a tipping point, which is a much smaller sector of the population, maybe like 10% or something. I don't know what the actual figure is, but that just gave me so much hope in the moment because that made me think, oh, this may be possible. This may be possible.
I'm sure that Mariann came up with that and I stole it from her, but
I really don't think so.
Yeah, I think it is 10%. I think that's what a tipping point is.
Yeah.
So it is worth hanging on to that.
Yeah. And I also, the other line that I quote from the philosopher Albert Camus, who is not speaking at all about animal rights, and I don't even have any idea his opinion of animals or ethics or food or anything like that. But I thought this line applies perfectly to the animal rights movement, which is, our task is impossible, so let us begin.
Right.
It's kind of like, well, it is what it is. We've got to do it.
What else are we going to do? Just
what else are we going to do?
And pretend it's not happening?
Yeah. So getting back to your story, which again, you may call it boring, but I find it so fascinating. So, you launched Our Hen House, it rapidly expanded, and you were married, and then your marriage ended, but the podcast continued, by all indications, very seamlessly. How was that for the two of you? Just navigating that transition and keeping the work going despite your personal, change.
I think it was bumpy. I think that there were times where it was really challenging, and I think that there were times where it was business as usual. And then I think we got to a point where we had enough time to sort of, heal from the bumpy parts and come back together as like very close friends, family. That's my take on it. Mariann maybe has a different one.
Covers it. I was happy to see that Kamala Harris's husband has a very, very close friendship with his ex-wife, and I was like, there's a model.
Exactly. And Wayne Brady
I think it did have something to do with the fact that we had the podcast, so we didn't want to give it up. So we kind of stuck it out for a while, and it wasn't nothing, but I don't that's enough said about that.
Yeah, I mean, Wayne Brady also has a reality show. It's terrible. But he has a reality show about how, he's chosen family with his ex-wife and her husband, and they raise this child together who's, not a child anymore. She's, 20. And, it's presented as this big radical thing. And I'm like, dude, lesbians have been doing this forever. So, yeah. Well, Kamala and Doug, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that's the short version.
Yeah. So I don't think
we need to go into the long version.
I always love the long version, but no, that's nice. And clearly you have this cause in common. And it's funny that you both mentioned the word, passion, like this being your passion. And it's mine as well. But I also just kind of see it as, it's my passion because it's important, it's not, it's not just something that I happen to be into, like collecting stamps or something,
Right.
it's like I like to think that I would be equally passionate about something I believe to be equally important.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
I mean, sorry.
No, you go.
I think one thing that we all deserve to remember, because I think it says something that I'm very proud of, is that it's the only movement. I mean, it's a political movement. It's a movement for political change and societal change. And it's the only movement I think that there's ever been where all of the participants are allies. The actual victims of the injustice are unable to speak up for themselves, except in the most unheard kind of ways. And so, yeah, I think that makes it much more than a passion. It's not a hobby or anything like that. Something we just enjoy doing. It's
Right.
it's a social justice movement that is completely populated by people who care about somebody else. And I think that's something we should all be proud of.
Yeah. I mean, and I agree. I agree, like in so many ways. And at the same time, again, and I'm sure you guys feel similarly in that I don't think it's like a very high moral baseline to not hurt animals if you don't have to.
Yeah.
So, am I proud of not participating in a sociopathic food system?
This is the second time I've had this conversation today. And the first was with my students. I teach writing at the University of Rochester. And I was having one of the students interview me because we were talking about interview skills, and she wasn't in the class yet when the students had interviewed each other. And I just kept kind of pausing her and having the other students pause her when there were like moments to go deeper. And she was asking me like what I was most proud of in terms of my advocacy. And I honestly found it so difficult to answer. I was like, I think that if you're passing somebody and they're drowning, most of us would probably jump in and try and save them. I mean, depending upon this scenario. And then those people are called heroes. And in some ways, sure, they're heroes, but in another way, they're not assholes. I hope I can say asshole. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I even said that to the students. I was like, so they're just like not an asshole. So I don't know. It doesn't feel like something that should be celebrated exactly. I'm just in ethical alignment with my beliefs.
Right. Right.
Well,
yeah. I feel 100%.
I'm still going to celebrate everybody out there, and not just people who are vegan. I agree. Veganism is just a moral baseline, but people who are out there working for animals.
Yeah.
I'm celebrating them. You two can.
Well, I'll celebrate other people. I'll celebrate you, and I'll celebrate Jasmin. Yeah, but I think the group Direct Action Everywhere, they have for me a way of framing the issue that makes sense. They say, like, if you're walking down the street, kind of like the drowning analogy, if you see somebody beating a puppy senseless, it's not enough to just say, oh, that's horrible, I'm not going to participate in that process. No, you intervene, you do something to save the puppy, to save the drowning person.
Right.
So, kind of raising the moral baseline a little bit, which took me as a vegan, being the sensitive introvert, that didn't come naturally to me, the activism piece. It definitely took some overcoming those personal limitations, and still takes that. So I would say, I guess for me, just on a personal level, if I'm proud of anything, it is that aspect of things, of stepping up and doing the things that I feel very uncomfortable doing, but that I feel are the right things to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel proud because I think they're anything that special, but I just know how I am and that it was hard for me to do it.
Yeah.
So I give myself credit for doing those things. Yeah. It's an interesting balance between giving credit where credit is due and realizing that at the same time, we can celebrate ourselves and we can feel so great about what we're doing and about all the wonderful people in this movement. And at the same time, at this very moment, animals are being tortured and are suffering and are being killed and don't have a moment's
it would be nice if
pleasure.
we could have a little bit more success. That's for sure.
That would be really nice. Yeah. So what are some of the successes that you both feel best about, or just have been the most gratified to see happen in the course of your life as vegan activists?
I think, I mean, obviously there's that mainstreaming of vegan food. I think to remember that story that we were talking about where we met with the pizza, that was shocking. And I'm sure the cheese was disgusting. Like, I have no idea what it was, but I remember very well, and I'm sure you do too, Chrissy, when Daya came out. And I was in LA for like some kind of an event or something, like campaign or something. And they only had the Daya at this one pizzeria in Silver Lake. And we went to it, me and the person who I was staying with. And it, like everything changed in that moment. I mean, I genuinely remember the bite. And so like Mariann was saying, it's hard to remember before the internet, like how we got information. We got it at Mariann. We got it at Angelica's kitchen in the front. They had all those brochures. That's where we got it.
I loved Angelica's kitchen.
Why did it close?
The best, just the best.
I was hard. That closed when I was living in New York City. That was very sad.
So sad. But I mean, actually, I wasn't even going to mention this, but it does bring it up. John's Pizzeria was directly next to Angelica's Pizzeria and was like a well-known Italian restaurant that decided to have a fully vegan menu at a time where no one was doing that. And it was because of the line outside at Angelica's kitchen.
Yeah. And I've been to John's many times, and I loved that too. It was very interesting because I think they also continued serving like veal
totally.
And,
right.
No, it was just for the business. They actually added all those vegan options just to get business.
And, like as a society, I think we're very quick to adjust to whatever the new normal becomes, whether that means like terrible droughts and floods. So on the bad side, but on the good side, like mainstreaming of vegan food, we're all sort of like, oh yeah, of course there's a Beyond Burger there. But this is actually huge. And it's about
the first time I had a Beyond Burger at Burger King, I cried.
Right.
I literally sat in my car and cried. And I'm not really a crier.
And she went to Burger King to like have the experience, and she told me she cried. And so
what made you cry, Mariann? Like, what was it?
It was just so unimaginable. I mean, I had been vegan for a long time, and the idea that a major chain would have a vegan burger was so unbelievable for so many years. It just seemed so huge. But like this, of course, one imagined that by now we would have all been vegan. One keeps imagining it's going to be faster than it is.
And you had to request it without cheese.
Yep.
Right.
And mayo, I think.
Right. And mayo. No, you didn't have to request it without cheese because it didn't come with cheese, but you had to request it without mayo. Yeah.
Okay.
And can I just go back? And I'm sorry to the audience for being an annoying New Yorker, but it wasn't John's Pizzeria, was it? John's Pizzeria was on Bleecker Street.
It was John's.
Oh,
John's.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. It was John's.
Just John's. Yes.
Try to get it right.
Thank you for correcting me, Professor.
Well, when it comes to food, we have to have our details correct.
Yes.
All right, ladies. Well, it's been such a pleasure having you on. I mean, again, you bring such a wealth of experience and charm and humor to this whole movement, and you've been role models to me and zillions of other people. So it's just wonderful to connect with you in person. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, we loved that. We loved that.
That was so much fun for me. I really felt like I had arrived in the vegan world when you had me on to talk about my novel, Marrying Myself. That was so much fun. And I appreciate that you both read the book.
Yeah.
That meant a lot
to
me too.
That's like that's certainly my favorite type of change making on a personal level is fiction and just the arts. So
I loved aside from the animal stuff, I loved the title and the concept behind the book. It was really
Thank you. Yeah, and in fact, it was partly based on that conversation that I ended up doing a talk at Vegan Summerfest this past summer on the topic of normalizing veganism through the arts.
Oh, cool!
Which I think is a very underutilized and hugely important area for advocacy.
1,000,000%.
It just widens the tent.
Totally.
You don't just attract people who are open to the message. You attract people who want to be entertained and amused and inspired.
Yes.
Well, final question, which I pose to all of my guests. Is there a particular word that for you sums up what being vegan is all about? And you can pick who goes first.
Mariann goes first.
Oh, thanks. Well, the one that came to mind, I don't know whether this is really right but the one that comes to mind is truth. Like living the truth just seems so important. And you can't live the truth if you're eating animals. I mean, not unless you're a psychopath. And you think that's fine to eat animals. But if people would just try to be true to how, just try to acknowledge that truth to themselves, I think the world would change.
Agreed. Good one.
The word that came to mind for me is sense, not like the pennies sense, but SENSE. It just makes sense. It's like the only sensible way forward. It is a way of living your life with sense as the anchor. So that's my word.
I love that. And that is one that I have not heard before. And that kind of harkens back to the whole discussion of sensitive people, because we're so
nice.
sensitive.
Well done.
We've got lots of sense.
Yeah,
callback.
nice circle you just made there.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And we close every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all of the suffering animals, human and non-human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So Mariann and Jasmin, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Jasmin. Thank you, Mariann.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thank you,
And
Chrissy.
till then, stay strong and stay true.
Thank you so much.